Ravi is a global technology executive and has over 25 years of professional experience in enterprise technology, business process services, and consulting. In addition to his work with BSIC since 2018, he is a technology advisor to the governance group, AS, focused on CSR initiatives globally.
Yes, thank you. I was going to share a few thoughts on some of the things we're working on at Blockchain for Social Impact and some of kind of the social movements that we're seeing where governments are getting engaged at different levels. And then I'm happy to kind of explore that further with some questions and kind of breakouts as appropriate. And then so CSR, obviously, the introduction refers to corporate social responsibility. In fact, Nick, who just gave a wonderful talk on baseline protocol, and we're talking about just the emphasis that we're seeing on corporate social responsibility, on environmental, social goals that are being evaluated, not just in the real world, but certainly in the world of blockchain as well, to evaluate the merits of a given project and to evaluate the even investments that people are making. So it's absolutely becoming a criteria. And in 2018, Blockchain for Social Impact in 2017 was spun out of Consensus as basically an organization that it's a US-based nonprofit that is interested in looking at how blockchain can be used to address a lot of the intractable challenges across multiple, mainly UN, Millennium Development Goals and development goals that we're seeing, focusing on the full range of education to energy and environment to human rights to pollution and the environment. And there are real world problems here. And as I think Nick also was mentioning, in many cases, people don't want to look at the underlying plumbing. They need their applications to work and deliver value. We're seeing organizations now looking at public blockchain as potentially a way to interact across multiple organizational boundaries and who want to collaborate together for be it commercial benefit, but also for the social and public good. So I wanted to share firstly a little bit about what Blockchain for Social Impact has done, some of our the observations from our last incubator, and then I'll dive into some examples of those and some ideas that we're toying around with and would love to get everyone's feedback here. So we're aiming to collaborate, to inspire, federate, and kind of create bridges with NGOs and government agencies and foundations, impact investors, philanthropists, and technologists by focusing on all those areas where there's a genuine social impact. So financial inclusion, supply chain, which again, Nick talked about in terms of baseline protocol and how it can help there. Identity and vulnerable populations, obviously a big area where the idea of a self-sovereign identity that's been around for a few years now in the world of blockchain can make a difference, but needs to actually impact people more broadly. Energy and the environment, human rights, health and wellness, and education. We've been hosting incubators or small incubators and hackathons since 2017, and there's been an evolving view of what success represents in these events. And they're initially really forums for diverse minds and ideas. So folks with experience actually on the ground with various social impact issues, working in specific industry sectors related to that, collaborating with our broad community of developers, especially mostly Ethereum developers and building applications on top of Ethereum. And obviously we had events that were in person in 2018, 2019, mainly here in New York or in Washington, which is where we're mostly based. But we've actually, over the last year, had them obviously all as remote events. We've run our incubator fully remotely. We've had teams from all over the world, and we've had presentations in our takeaway events that have been entirely global since they've been run online. And so in that sense, when we look at the benefit and the capability of social entrepreneurs, it's essentially serving as a catalyst to transform that current environment and creating new capabilities as a result. We've had firms like Nori that have really focused on, for instance, capturing carbon credit that came out of the 2018 incubator and now has grown into a full-fledged enterprise. So it's quite inspirational. In the 2020 incubator, we focused on plastics and pollution, sustainable cities, carbon footprint, and related special challenges as really where firms could incubate their ideas, kind of sprint over the course of 4 weeks to create an interim proof of concept type solution, and have those mentored by our colleagues and then judged by peers that we had in the industry who really spent their time on this, and then help folks in terms of refining those ideas to push it forward. And there have been some inspirational results. We obviously had regional issues or power outages all over the world, lockdown restrictions that prevented some folks from working efficiently, teams that had to be formed entirely remotely all over the world with team members in different geographies. But we were surprised and inspired by how many teams pulled through and the resilience of the individuals who were involved. There are some interesting teams that came out of it that won various prizes from our sponsors and then from various contributors. We had CO2 Ken, which focused on carbon footprint, Treeger, which I'll talk about in a minute, Bienvenir, Rent My Tent, that focused on kind of rent control in different areas, Lease on the Block, also focusing on rent control and management of that whole process, Wolfpack, Abundance, etc. So Treeger, very interesting borderless approach for climate action powered by blockchain. So essentially, how do you bring together the communities that are actually planting trees for various reasons, but mainly in order to make a difference as far as carbon footprint is concerned, and those that actually want to fund and make an actual difference directly, and especially when a lot of the tree planting is occurring in remote areas all over the world. So how do you funnel those funds in the most efficient, direct way possible? How do you ensure that the trees are actually traceable, so your contributions are traceable? And then, as appropriate, how do you arrange for that oxygen that's being released by those trees to be tokenized and thus traceable carbon credit? So Treeger is attempting to address all of those issues, which makes it very, very interesting with the help that we've been doing, and then ERMI is continuing to make that effort all over the world. And what becomes interesting here is because of that granular level of data of where the funds are going, the actual trees that are being planted, and then measuring the results of those trees in a very, very transparent and efficient manner, really built fully on public blockchain, there's a chance with all this open data for scientists to more directly and study impact in more of a real-time manner. And then this information can be fed back to governments in those countries as well that have their own regional as well as global goals that in many cases they are committed to meeting. So there's still a long way to go in terms of bringing these type of solutions to an industrial or mass scale level. But these efforts that we're able to incubate, I think, get us in the right direction. And then related, CO2 Ken, for instance, is another firm that was incubated in the 2020 cycle that we had, or cohort that we had. And they were focused on building a decentralized carbon accounting system. So building in an automation for carbon offsets. And so that way folks can enter information, you can track it, and you can do this across, again, fully public blockchain with folks operating remotely and being able to contribute in that sense from a global level. And so in terms of our incubators, we continue to follow up with a lot of these teams. We're trying to bring presentations and webinars from them and see how their projects evolved, how the individuals continue to build relationships with each other. And we've had firms that have gotten funded and grown to the next level, like the examples I just gave. And in some cases, we've had folks, mentors and hired participants engage with each other, and that cross-pollination, I think, has taken this to the next level. So other examples with government, which I think have been very, very interesting. And again, this government at multiple levels dipping its toe. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of projects all over the world where governments are actively taking interest. There are jurisdictions like Dubai, which have gone all in and are really addressing it from a national level in terms of the entire United Arab Emirates. And then there are different efforts, obviously, of digital currencies that are being explored all over the world. But in terms of social impact purposes, one interesting project we were involved with was with MyPass, which is an identity app developed primarily for people experiencing homelessness in the city of Austin, in Texas. And this is a story that I think I'm sure everyone on this call is very much aware of. Government services often require having verifiable government-issued identification. And this is true almost everywhere globally. You need a birth certificate. In the United States, you need something called a social security card or a driver's license. In Europe, you may need some national ID. And in other jurisdictions, sometimes you have to literally bribe people in order to get past some of those blockers that people may or may not have, because these documents don't exist, or they're not accurate, or they might be in a foreign language, or you've been displaced, especially, and this is true in Europe and Asia, where you have displaced populations. So this is an ongoing challenge, and there have been many efforts at decentralized identities. So Adam Wiedemann, who's now on our advisory board and at the time was driving this project with the city of Austin, believed that just while moving those pieces of paper from the backpack of a homeless person to a smartphone can help, and people were doing that, but building an identity in a manner that people trusted and had ownership of that identity, where these documents existed or not, can make potentially a bigger difference. So the idea is obviously leveraging the idea of credentialed blockchain identities to break down a lot of these systemic inequities in reputation building that exists today, especially in the US. And this is true with these most vulnerable populations who have the hardest time re-entering the system. And just at a tactical level, the examples we can look at here is, and some of these are more United States type examples, but they can be applicable elsewhere. You'll have someone who's been in the prison system for the last 10 years. And 10 years, as we all know in the world of technology, could be a lifetime. And then they exit the prison system and they actually don't have any documents that allow them to re-enter society in any meaningful manner that allow them to do the most basic of activities. Forget even trying to get employment. They can barely get on a public transport if they don't have access to a bank account, if they don't have access to other basic infrastructure that a lot of people need in order to survive. And so MyPass was an idea that the city of Austin had to protect this most vulnerable population from arguably digital vulnerability and allow them to connect to at least some of the most basic government services. So building using Web3 and blockchain, self-sovereign identity for digital populations, who may not always trust their governments, to be able to interact and at least benefit from some of the services that the government is able to provide. And there are other issues in there, including multi-factor authentication. But in many cases, it's actually less of a technical problem. And then similar to what Nick was saying earlier, well, how do you actually make this usable? People don't want to think about the plumbing. How do you design a login system for people who've experienced this type of trauma? What does their user experience need to look like? How do we identify patterns across our different experiences and then design systems to support that? And then abstract that into a system. And how do we leverage these tools so it becomes easy to use for someone who may only have a smartphone that they've just picked up? And a lot of these experiences already exist. People are able to use so many other apps that aren't necessarily the blockchain world. And we've seen evolution of certainly things like Cello, which has really been designed for mobile value transfer, especially in a lot of countries outside the US, that potentially can help. So I think it's a very, very exciting time for these type of applications. And it's an exciting time for the city of Austin as they try and roll out MyPass as well. So we were excited to have the opportunity to advise them and really help in really framing those thoughts out. And I wanted to talk further then about the area of supply chain also, and that was something Nick talked about as well in terms of how baseline protocol can help. But when we look at supply chain and how supply chains, commercial supply chains, as well as those that can impact the public good as well, really a lot of the benefits are all around securing payments, speeding up some documentation, safeguarding goods, especially of value, and improving origin and provenance, and then as necessary, smart automated contracts for payments to the right parties and intermediaries. But there's a focus, I think, especially when it's goods of public value. We'll talk about a couple of examples on kind of citizen and stakeholder-driven governance, and on looking at some of the ideas that the World Bank and UNICEF themselves are directly piloting, as well as just regional municipalities in many cases, kind of at that granular level, are trying to explore in order to make sure that goods of public value, of public relevance, can be tracked and managed in a reasonable way. So one obviously is a supply chain for critical supplies. So one project that I was briefly involved with was the post the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. So that was 5-6 years ago. There were major efforts that were built after that to use the localized distribution centers for better management of the relief supplies and strengthening the disaster management information system to manage all the information about local relief supplies that needed to be available across what is a relatively poor country with a lot of diverse terrain and mountainous terrain and remote villages, and the need for localized distribution infrastructure lacking being one of the major reasons for the massive death toll in the earthquake and frankly post-earthquake because of health and other reasons. So our supplies kept up to date in all locations. It's all the traditional challenges with disaster supplies. Is there any corruption and loss and theft of supplies as a result? Are audits being done regularly? Is equipment being updated and renewed when it needs to be for that type of equipment? And the information processes that are being stood up related to kind of the gathering, recording, analyzing, and disseminating data about the hazards and vulnerabilities. How well are they being maintained? So there's the opportunity, and which we proposed with them and still being worked on at this point, to apply all the wonderful elements of the distributed ledger supply chain to build a platform that multiple disparate jurisdictions. You've got a central government, you've got regional governments, you've got municipalities, you've got these villagers or gram panchayats who need to access that information and can do so again through this idea of a public blockchain that stores this information across multiple jurisdictions. And really the pandemic exposed some of the most egregious examples of this globally, with PPE orders not being delivered to the right parties back when those were very much in having a shortage. You had San Francisco's orders going to Europe. You had little transparency on why this was happening. And so slowly this will improve over time. And if it saves even a handful of lives, that will have made a difference. And so it still will be based on education, make sure people that can actually use that. But I think advising them on leveraging becomes very, very interesting. Another example through another firm, Afro Valley, that we've been exposed to is kind of looking at municipal citizen facilities. So this is still in the exploratory phases, but something we're looking at is how can the use of blockchain, not just for registration and for tracking, but also for incentive and bounties, be used to improve information flow, especially in kind of in urban environments and kind of surrounding suburban environments. So in Africa as a whole, across the continent, there's a measure that approximately 1/3 of the hand pumps, water hand pumps, are broken. So there have been a lot of projects to install hand pumps, and most of them have gone through, and then hand pumps installed to tap into groundwater, especially the water shortages all over. But in many cases, the poor quality of the hand pumps after a few years where they're broken has to do with not understanding how to maintain and repair them, a lack of accountability, and poor follow-up. So how do we create an environment where these life-saving utilities can be better maintained? How do we identify who are all the stakeholders and who are the local administration staff members who not only have a stake, but then potentially be held responsible? So this information in many cases is not being tracked at all, to being tracked kind of in a manual way. And as a result, the accountability doesn't exist. So what we're exploring is there a method by which we can use incentivization? So if the accountable parties or even third parties receive points or bounties for the number of hand pumps in operation in the region, as well as the number of hand pumps being repaired. And that's managed and distributed in a transparent manner in the blockchain that tracks the status of all these hand pumps. We have a way of ensuring that team members are efficiently and directly rewarded and traced back to individual hand pumps. Again, similar to what Treger was doing with trees. And so there's that potential to really explore embedding reward tokens into a smart contract for the repair of what is a municipal asset or utility for the public good. And so I think that becomes really exciting if that mentality and thinking can start to get incorporated. So these are the type of projects that we're thinking about that potentially could make a difference. In other areas where I think supply chain becomes really, really interesting is actually obviously the world of food and agriculture. So that world has obviously similar challenges that supply chains have in general in terms of kind of securing payments, proving the origin and managing traceability, and then managing the identity, especially when you have subsistence farmers or individual farm plots that are producing results. And so there's some interesting firms that we've worked with that are trying to make a difference in the space. So AgriLedger is focusing on the entire agricultural supply chain as a whole, and really just ensuring that the producers, the individual farmers that are producing fruits and vegetables, through to the middlemen who are transporting them, through to obviously the distributors who ultimately will take this to the grocers, all have a system by which that you can track the provenance as well as the payments, and ensuring that the payments are made promptly and efficiently at the right time to the original source providers. In many cases, we still have middlemen really controlling this in a lot of these jurisdictions. So AgriLedger is trying to make a difference by having a unified ledger across all these multiple parties using public blockchain. Then Afro Valley, which is an Ethiopia-based startup that's now looking at doing for the entire ecosystem, initially focusing on coffee. So looking at the production of coffee, working with the government on whatever approvals and compliance requirements that may exist, ensuring that those farmers have an identity that can track to whatever permits they need to have in order to grow and distribute this coffee. The middlemen, obviously, who take control of this, who arrange for transportation, and then through to payment through to the distributors, who then ultimately bring this out to the grocers locally, as well as export this for the global markets. So these efforts, I think, become very, very interesting for making a directly improving and changing the lives of subsistence farmers who in many cases are operating the same way that they did 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, where they're producing something, they're getting paid, essentially inflation notwithstanding, whatever they were getting paid before. In some cases it's changing and not in a positive way, and they're not able to take advantage of a broader system that allows them to think about scaling or think about leveraging the benefits of a broader financial system. For this year, primarily at Blockchain for Social Impact, we've been looking at a new bootcamp and incubator that will be starting actually next month. And our focus, given the hype around non-fungible tokens, around NFTs, is an ideation bootcamp followed by an actual incubator, so running through February 2022, where we're looking at, and I'm inviting this entire audience and others as well to participate, an ideation phase on how can we look at using NFTs for social impact, or how can we take advantage of this environment where NFTs are being valued, are being transacted, and there's a large market now and address many social impact goals. And that could be just measuring the minting and the costs of creating NFTs, through to obviously efforts to raise funds through NFTs for identified social and environmental costs. So you're seeing some NFT wildlife efforts that are occurring already, and you're seeing some efforts around the measuring the footprint from minting NFTs and some assistance in that area, and depending on the platform being used. And so we're really excited about some of the solutions that potentially could come out of this. So our ideation phase begins in November, starting the 4th of November, 2021. It will run through the end of December, and then we'll be using selected teams to actually run a 3-week incubator sprint, if you will, or a hack, where they can, with the assistance of mentors, develop a proof of concept, and then we can start to present those. So once we get to that phase, I'll be looking forward to kind of everyone's feedback on that. As an example, I was speaking with one firm in Europe, in Hungary, Code Cluster. It's a Hungary-based blockchain kind of incubator environment or startup group that is helping firms build solutions in using blockchain in Hungary. And they were actually interested in looking on their own at Mike Vites, who's the founder there, at a fully democratic platform where people can vote for valuable charity organizations and then decide for what specific causes to raise money for. So the Ethereum-based platform that they're in the process of formulating called Downation, where you can support local problems by leveraging a global autonomous community and sort of create this environment of charity as a service. So you can then determine very tactically which charities are of the most interest to you, and then make sure your funds are steered in that direction. So I will, Christian or Nancy or I will put the link for the Blockchain for Social Impact incubator in the chat here shortly, but it's basically blockchainforsocialimpact.com/incubator for more details, and we'll continue to update that over the course of the next few weeks. I'm happy to take some additional questions and kind of explore some of these topics further at this time.
All right, great stuff, Ravi. Thank you for that. Yeah, please share a link in the chat. I think I'm certainly keen to follow that and read more up on it, because I was, while you were talking, I was thinking about some of the values that we hold inside Vector Labs, and often what comes up is this ability to participate and break boundaries and let more people participate in whatever way they currently can't, and really blockchains technology for that. And it sounds like you're very much on that same page. And my question is, like, often when we work with clients now, we spend a lot of time educating them, talking about what I often refer to as decentralized models or decentralized business models, and it often requires a little bit of a different sort of approach from their point of view, where traditionally they might try and be a central actor or a third party sitting in between, but with these new models and with blockchain technology, you might rethink that approach a little bit. And my question is, what's your take on the maturity out there? Have you seen this progressing in the right direction with regards to bringing in blockchain and think about how to use this correctly?
I'm sorry, Christian, it was cutting in and out for me, but I think you're asking about the maturity of the various blockchain platforms for some of the social impact efforts.
a little bit more towards the maturity in thinking with the organizations you're working with regards to using blockchain?
Oh, yes. It's a very good question. The maturity of the organizations we're dealing with is, it unfortunately runs the full spectrum. So you have efforts, for instance, within the UN, where there's a whole UN blockchain itself was a forum that was set up. And they had some conferences where they brought in a lot of the leading firms that were trying to build solutions. They had firms like Microsoft. Again, they might be building their own managed permission systems. That's one thing. But they had Accenture, they had Consensus, and they had Deloitte, and they had several other firms that are trying to present solutions. There's still a lot of hesitation. So everyone is happy to talk. They're happy to bring in all kinds of firms. If I mention Baseline Protocol, they will be more than happy to speak to Baseline Protocol, just as an example, to any one of these parties would. Are they ready to execute, and at this point, even in the world of what you might call a proof of concept or a trial, that certainly a couple of years ago, that was get rarer. And I think we're starting to see some examples of people trying that. This is very much an environment, and it kind of relates to just technology in the public sector as well, where unfortunately, it's not democratic. The top-down approach, there's an element of top-down approach, where if the leadership can be bought in, and if the legal environment allows this to have value, and that is actually a very key criteria, then I think we're able to approach this with a little bit more confidence. And so you see jurisdictions like Estonia and UAE, and maybe even El Salvador in some cases, that are attempting to make some efforts in this case, and some jurisdictions within the US as well, for that matter, some states in the US. So I think that will help accelerate the maturity. But we reached a stage where almost everyone knows about it and is willing to talk.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I think the other thing you touched on is this thing which is often referred to as tokenization, right? Where you can, like you had an example of well, and if the incentives to maybe take care of it, as far as I understood, could be tokenized somehow, and people were incentivized through that, they would take better care of it, right? And again, I guess it relates to that breaking down and allowing people to participate more closely than having someone in between. But do you see tokenization requiring a lot of legal change before it can sort of happen on a larger scale?
Yes. Yeah. So I think a lot of these ideas, people are, especially in parts of Africa, where there's very much an openness in a lot of jurisdictions for these type of new technology projects, is an absolute openness to proof of concepts and trialing this as an effort. So can we do this in an isolated manner and see how it works? But then ultimately, for it to scale and go beyond just, oh, this is a nice project, it worked here and nobody really had a problem with it, to actually be something that is going to operate in a manner where it can reduce that kind of 1/3 of water pumps down to like 1/4 or 1/8 of water pumps. It will require not just formal legal, but there's an element, I think, of public sector marketing as well, where people realize this is the new way, and you thinking of how government should work from a customer service standpoint, which doesn't have anything to do with blockchain. Blockchain is just, again, a tool to help us kind of build trust across multiple parties. But that customer service element is there, and that is absolutely there in many areas. I do think we'll start to see examples of that over the next, like if we have this conversation 3-4 years from now, we will start to see some of those scale examples in some areas more than others, and that will inspire people, I think, hopefully to continue.
Okay, perfect. And just a final question for me, if you have time. In a crisis situation where you need to deliver aids quickly to the people who need it, and you might want to try and deploy this sort of technology to help keep people accountable, how would you say we can do that reliably? Because we don't want to necessarily add too much technical risk on top of such a situation, I would say.
Yeah. So when we were talking to UNDP with the governance group for what happened post the earthquake in Nepal, it's less. It's actually less during a crisis. It's more, what are you actually doing in your spare time when there is no crisis? So this is setting up the infrastructure and being ready for the next crisis. When you're in a crisis, it's basically kind of all hands on deck and you're doing whatever you need to do. And so I agree, having the technical burden to have to document, oh, I took this many tents out and this many food packets and this many water packets and this many blankets or whatever out of the facility is not, that's a burden. And then ensuring that's documented and propagated and making sure, oh, everyone can see it. That's not the issue at that time. But actually knowing that opening, you don't want to be open. The challenge is right now, if you're going to open the door to some of those municipal facilities that are scattered all across the country that were built post the earthquake, you're not sure what's in a lot of them because people have been pilfering them, and some of the equipment has been maintained. And so there's no blockchain element there, but there's again a method by which we can hold multiple parties that have multiple across multiple jurisdictions accountable for maintaining and tracking the information that they have. And yes, people are doing it with traditional databases too, but I think this is something we're exploring relative to both incentives as well as building this in a manner that in a public blockchain manner, because it's across multiple jurisdictions.
Thank you again a lot. Very good, very interesting